Okay, so this is going to be the chapter 13 glycolysis video. So who's the biggest eater on the planet? Well, there's a lot of contenders. Obviously, the African elephant has to eat quite a bit to maintain its body weight. It's a mammal, so it's going to be maintaining temperature. All of that homeostasis is going to require a lot of energy. Um, the whale shark, although it's cold-blooded, is because of its size. It's going to be eating a lot. Um, how does it get so big if it's um, what does it eat to get as large as it does? Just just plankton, you know. So it doesn't have to eat huge things. It could eat small things and still get a lot of calories out of it. Um, as far as people goes, you've always got the competitive eating people that go to the Nathan's hot dog event, and I'm sure that Joey Chestnut, 68 hot dogs in 10 minutes. Um, he's a big eater, um, but nobody pound for pound does better than the red-throated hummingbird. Um, although tiny, it is beating its wings so fast that it is just burning through energy. Um, 90 times a second it's going to beat its wings. It's hard. It's beating more than 1,200 beats a minute. Um, respiration rate really fast. Why is its heart beating so fast, and why is its respiration rate so fast? Because it's burning a lot of calories to be able to burn to beat those wings 90 times per second. So it's got the fastest metabolism on the planet. Um, so all this work is going to require a lot of fuel. So it eats sugar water straight out of the uh, flowers or sugar water from my hummingbird feeders in my backyard. So a 3-gram bird drinks about 43 grams of sugar water in a day. That's 14 times its own body weight in just sugar. Um, that that is very surprising, right? A hummingbird is always just a few hours away from being dead because of starvation. Um, so, so they can't be too far from a food source at any given time. And here in North America, of course, when it's cold, there are no flowering plants producing nectar, so they're going to have to migrate south to get to those uh, those flowering plants. So they'll fly about 2,000 miles um, to get down to the wintering grounds, and then then they have to return. That's like 20 miles a day. Um, so they have to store up a bunch of energy to be able to make that flight. So during migration, um, they're first going to use the sugars um, from their blood and their liver. And when that's depleted, then they're going to use up any fat that they've stored up. Um, when their fat is depleted, then they're going to have to stop flying and eat as much as they can to put away some more energy. When the when the energy starts coming from digesting proteins in their own muscles, then they're not going to be able to fly very well, and that's going to reduce their chance of survival. That's also true of people. When somebody is going into ketosis, they're doing muscle damage. It's going to reduce how well their heart works. We store sugar in our cells as a glucose polymer called glycogen. And so when we have extra sugar, we'll put that sugar away as glycogen stores. Plants store their extra sugar as starch. And so there's a constant um, putting away sugar as stores and then utilizing it. And so we have some cell signaling that's involved in deciding when to take these glycogen granules and break them down into glucose for cellular metabolism. Um, Plants, same thing. They're going to have cell signaling that decides when they need to put it away as starch and when they need to get it out and use it as energy. So there's quite a involved intermediate metabolism. It almost looks like a wiring diagram for a computer with lots of enzymes involved. Probably the ones that you're most familiar with are the carbohydrate metabolism right down here in the center. This carbohydrate metabolism is probably the one that you're most familiar with. But um, there's lipid metabolism and amino acid metabolism, making and breaking down amino acids, lipids, sugars, uh, even nucleotides, because we have to use them to make our proteins, to make our DNA, but we also have to make enough energy. So, what is the cell signaling involved to getting glucose into the cells and out of the cells? It's all taking place here in the pancreas. These beta islet cells are going to release insulin when there's extra sugar around. And then the alpha cells will release uh, glycogen, or I'm sorry, glucagon, um, when there's not enough sugar around. And so the glucagon will be a signal to break down glycogen, and the insulin will be a signal to take up the sugar out of the bloodstream and store it away, mostly in the liver, but also, or mostly in the muscles, but also in the liver, store it away. The muscles are our primary sugar storage area. So, so there's this constant negative feedback loop that's saying uh, you you have too much blood glucose, so you release insulin so that you can turn glucose to glycogen and bring your blood glucose level back down to normal. Or you don't have enough blood glucose, so you release uh, glucagon to uh, break down that glycogen back into glucose and bring your blood glucose level back up. So, how do we release um, this these signals? Um, so, if we store up a bunch of insulin into vesicles, we dock them and prime them, very similar to what we already looked at in the neurons for exocytosis. And then the signal itself to release insulin is going to be glucose. Um, the GLUT2 transporter, it's facilitated diffusion, so the glucose is going down its concentration gradient. And unlike GLUT1 and GLUT3, which have a very low Km, high affinity for glucose, like down in the 1 millimolar range, GLUT2 is much higher. It's up in the 15 millimolar range Km. And so it's not going to start moving glucose until uh, glucose level is high. And so it's a sensor of high glucose. when the glucose goes into the cell, then glycolysis is going to break down that glucose and produce some ATPs. And those ATPs are going to be a ligand that binds to uh, a potassium channel. And normally this potassium channel is open and potassium is flowing out through the channel constantly. So when there's ATP around, because there was high glucose, um, so high glucose comes in through the GLUT2 transporter, gets broken down by glycolysis, and binds to the potassium channel. And when that potassium channel closes, now that potassium is not leaving anymore. If the normal equilibrium required that there was a bunch of potassium leaving constantly, closing off that potassium channel is going to cause more uh, positives inside of the cell. This is going to cause a depolarization of the membrane. That depolarization of the membrane is going to um, it's going to cause the voltage gated calcium channel to open. Voltage gated calcium channel opens, calcium comes in, and just like in the neurons, that calcium is going to be sensed by the synaptotagmin, a different synaptotagmin, but it's still a synaptotagmin on the vesicles and cause regulated exocytosis and release insulin into the bloodstream, and that insulin is then going to be a signal um, to to the muscles to take up glucose and store it as glycogen. So look at the GLUT2 transporter activation of insulin released into the bloodstream. That's pretty important pathway for you to be familiar with because it is illustrative of how we can use stuff that we've already talked about, movement across the membrane, to do one of the most fundamental homeostasis pathways, signaling pathways of, of the human body. Okay, so there's another uh, low affinity GLUT transporter, GLUT4, and GLUT4 is insulin sensitive. So so when insulin gets released by the beta islet cells in response to high glucose through the GLUT2 transporter that we just talked about, that insulin molecule is going to bind to the insulin receptor, and one of the downstream effects of insulin signaling is that most of the GLUT4 transporters are sequestered out of the cell membrane and in vesicles down in the cell. But in response to insulin, then those vesicles with the GLUT4 transporter are going to move up to the cell membrane and allow for those muscle cells to take up more glucose. So so the beta islet cells sensed high glucose. They released insulin. The insulin then signaled the muscles to take up more glucose. And so now the muscles can make that glucose into glycogen, storing it and getting it out of the bloodstream. So that's the first half of the chapter 13 slides. You can move on to the next video if you'd like.